It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, Sana. I know she's not here, but maybe she's watching it online. You never know. And I'm very honored to have been invited to be part of this really important speaker series. And let me also say, Mark is one of my favorite kind of peer scholars. I remember us meeting, it was in Doha, and you had by far the most interesting and critical, I think, but critical yet interesting sort of work that I saw pretty much in a conference which was sort of, I would say, blindly celebrating technological expansion and access. And I think you and I were, I think I was particularly vocal, grumbling about that a little bit. But since that time, I've been periodically in contact with you, Mark, and I really appreciate your work and you. So, and so what I'm going to attempt to do today is lay out a few arguments. A lot of this will be material that many of you know about, but I just want to kind of build it out a little bit so we can have at least a conversation about it. And I'm also going to give some teasers from material that I'm working on in relation to my new book, which is my third book with MIT Press, which right now I'm calling We the Users. Why don't you tell me if you can think of a better title than that? And that's going to be a crossover book. It's likely to be a bit of a trade meets academic book, which is something I'm very excited about. So I'll give you some teasers around that as well. This is the cover of my first book, so they like to say, you know, don't judge a book by its cover, but I like this cover quite a bit, so feel free to judge it a little bit on that. This is, of course, a very central, let me start by a very central image in Mark's work and the work of other scholars who look at the geographies of the supposedly so-called immaterial internet, right, the cloud and so on. And what you see when you look at the fiber optic cables that form the backbone, the foundation of the global internet, is it's rooted in relationships that are expressive of how power functions in the world. Not power as in electrical power, but political power, social power, economic power, right? And so just like you can trace where airlines go from one point to another, you see high correlations also where network infrastructures are laid. So that's why we see so much of a sort of local organizing and geopolitical sorts of local arrangements in relation to the very bases, the placement of infrastructures. And of course, that's not the only way in which folks around the world access the so-called global internet, knowing fully well that there's a Chinese, if you will, intranet that exists in massive parallel form with some interactions with the larger internet. But there's also, of course, satellites, as my colleague Lisa Parks, formerly UC Santa Barbara, now at MIT, and we work quite closely together. She has looked in the past at other kinds of infrastructures of connectivity, knowing that infrastructures themselves are not simply neutral or engineering oriented, but reflect various types of social, cultural, and political arrangements. So I sort of transitioned to look at this image right here, where we think about the metaphor of the cloud and how, you know, immateriality is sort of a way in which the internet is sort of being expressed and lauded and described. But actually, if you graft on, you know, various sorts of proprietary terms of service platforms on top of the cloud, and Amazon is not here, but there are so many others as well, you can actually see that what we might treat as an immaterial or invisible or neutral infrastructure is actually based upon very specific kinds of political and economic arrangements. So the reason I put these three up there is in the last couple of years, and I'll talk about this very briefly later, I've been doing my fieldwork in southern Mexico, in the Oaxaca region. And folks down there, of course, when they send emails or messages to one another, even if it's very close by to one another, I was able to read some local estimates on studies. They're not totally authoritative, but they basically show about 70 to 80% of all emails that are sent within the Oaxaca region between folks go through one of these three proprietary servers, right, or three kind of cloud-based platforms. So what that means is notions of territoriality, locality, in relation to data, in relation to technology, are not necessarily true, right? So there's always forms of mediation, transactions, arrangements by which we can understand how our digital communications are expressed, right? And so to me, that's really important because as we know, intermediaries have come to become some of the most lucrative companies in the world. Platforms is another word that people use, right? And so this is an image that I took from the business world, actually, which sort of looks at the idea of how the so-called frictionless digital platform actually can facilitate exchange, yet also monetize exchange. So what happens as we sort of move to platforms that are supposed to make our lives more efficient, potentially, and they do potentially as consumers, is we displace other kinds of arrangements that we may have taken for granted, like work, like labor, like income, like ownership, right? And so it's very important to note this because many of the companies by which sort of media are exchanged or goods are exchanged, or even vehicles and travel are exchanged, brand themselves as technology companies, right? Uber does not claim to be a taxi service company. By branding itself as a technology company, and it does so in all its legal documents, it can move out of that kind of the sorts of forms of regulation and scrutiny, I would say, that a traditional sort of industry might have. And of course, there have been pushbacks, and I think we're in a place where there's a much more robust, you may not think so, but I come from the United States, a much more robust pro-workers kind of way of thinking about these issues. So I just want to kind of start by thinking about that, right? So what does that mean? And this is kind of an old story when Instagram is sold to Facebook for over $1 billion with between 15 and 20 employees within 3 or 4 months, if I'm not mistaken, of the time when Kodak, with tens of thousands of employees, went bankrupt. Both imaging companies, both actually very actively engaged in digital imaging. Perhaps the pioneers of digital imaging could at least be partly Kodak, right? So it's not simply about I'm into new technology and you're not. It's about what types of uses of technology can minimize costs associated with labor and transactions while maximizing returns in relation to fairly invisible exchanges, right? So those transactions, those ghosts in the machine, are ones that I think we need to open those up and understand how those kinds of transactional arrangements, branded as technological ones, are profoundly affecting our lives far outside of the sphere of technology itself, our political lives, our economic lives, our environmental lives. So this is kind of an absurd example, but it's just a good place to start. I don't know how many of you knew of this example. This is a company out of St. Petersburg, Russia, called FaceApp, and they just built, sort of a hot or not kind of part 2, part 3, that was, essentially going, combing, crawling the internet, taking images and attempting to make those images more, quote unquote, beautiful. So they took a man who's widely seen as quite handsome, and no matter what else we might think of him, I'm not talking about Donald Trump either, and made his face more white, right? And so this is kind of just a kind of a whimsical example, but it actually points to something far more underlying and problematic, which is, as my colleague Kathy O'Neill points out in her book, excellent book, Weapons of Math Destruction, how algorithms function, right? And many of you have a deeper knowledge of that on a technical level than myself. My knowledge is fairly dated, but I do have an applied engineering and mathematics background historically. But when we build systems, we have a few parameters to them, right? We have models of success that we build into them, like threshold models of success, recipes, as Kathy puts it. We have ideas of what data those systems learn from, and then we also build mechanisms by which those systems learn themselves, right? So what we're talking about are cultural, political expressions of what counts as knowledge, right? What are the data sets we learn from, how the learning models we build are doing those forms of learning, with what types of effects. So those are not simply neutral technical expressions. Those are expressions that come out of who we are. They might come out of corporate cultures. They might come out of perhaps white male cultures. They might come out of hetero-patriarchal kinds of systems of knowledge, if you will. There are all sorts of different ways we could look at this. And I'm kind of pushing it a little by making that last statement. But the point I want to make is when we build code, when we build systems, it's not simply some sort of neutral expression, right? So the reason why I want to talk about that is this can have far more pernicious sorts of effects and understandings. How many of you, just out of curiosity, were aware of this work done by ProPublica? Okay, so I don't need to belabor it, but let me just kind of explain what this is about. So this is really important journalism that was done recently that discusses the recidivism systems, sort of systems that predict the risk of repeat crimes, of recidivism itself. done by ProPublica. A company called NorthPoint was doing this. And what was found in this research is a system that might be used in court sentencing and so on was likely to falsely flag black defendants as future criminals at almost twice the rate as white defendants. And the most important part of this is the disparity in those results couldn't be explained by the prior history or prior crimes of those defendants. A judge looking at this system, it was called Compass, described it as, quote, a guy who has molested a child every day for a year could come out as low risk. And in this system, in the data that it revealed, it showed that black folks are predicted at a 77% rate to be more likely as having a higher risk of committing a future violent crime, not normal crime, but violent crime, and 45% more likely to be predicted to commit a future crime of any kind. So obviously, the folks that I'm not saying obviously, it's very likely the folks who created the system are not necessarily biased in a profound or explicit sense. I want to give that sort of, kind of give that disclaimer. They didn't even ask in the survey data that they used to kind of feed data into this system what one's race was. But they asked other questions that are indicative of race. And this is how things function, right? Not only is work on implicit bias widely known, I'm not the expert on it, but I cite that work, but we also see that other questions that we ask about environment and so on might actually be highly positively correlated with questions of race. I'll give you a few examples. Was one of your parents ever sent to jail or prison? How many of your friends or acquaintances take drugs illegally? How often did you get into fights at school? Agree or disagree with statements such as, a hungry person has a right to steal. If people make me angry, I get angry myself. So it's not sure, it's not necessarily clear that every one of those questions, I'm not trying to claim that, is positively correlated to people of color and black people in particular in the United States. But enough of them are where when these sorts of forms of data are fed into systems that then inform judgments of sentencing, that then what we could have are systemic biases that are encoded in so-called neutral and natural systems that inform our lives. And a big part of this, and really a big part of the issue more generally in the United States, and you all can speak to me about the UK in relation to this, is our turn toward privatization, not only in our prisoning systems, but also in our policing systems and the kinds of technological systems that inform policing itself. So these are environmental factors that shape discrimination's effects and normalize them, right? And I think that's the point, right? Normalization is easy to accept, not only because it's normalizing, but because we're all way too busy. We've farmed out our lives to various systems that are supposed to make our lives more efficient, and those sorts of systems are inscrutable and invisible. And on a large-scale, data-oriented level, it's almost entirely impossible to understand what shapes the kinds of outputs that we see by large-scale big data systems, because not only of the incredible multidimensional matrices that are being computed upon, all thanks to our release of data with our mobile phones, but also just the scale that we're speaking about, the scale of these effects. So risk scores are really important. The United States locks up far more people than any other country, and a disproportionate number of them black. And often when I kind of raise examples like this, and others raise examples like this who are actually, kind of full first-order scholars of this work, you get the response, well, judges are racist. and yes, judges are racist. In fact, all of us have various forms of implicit bias. I can actually see that in myself in various manners. The question, though, isn't whether we should build technologies that are patterned on that racism, or perhaps even slightly better than that kind of obvious subjective bias. But the real question for me is, what kinds of technologies should we aspire toward? And those sorts of questions are not really about technology. Those questions are ethical, those questions are social, and they're questions that relate to how we want to be as a society, how we want to divide our so-called public spheres and private lives. What kinds of systems do we need to check power? And so those questions, if we have to be discussed, not just when we talk about any aspect of our lives, but also when we talk about the increasingly digital saturation, or the saturation of our lives by digital technologies. So to give you another example, this is right home for me in Los Angeles. Sadly, a colleague of mine, I don't know him very well, in the anthropology department, is behind a lot of this work itself, but this relates to work by a company called Predictive Policing, right? And is now, their systems are now being applied to take crime reports, to basically take like data extracted from crime reports and make decisions about whether they should be classified as quote unquote gang violence, right? And this is now being applied in over 1/3 of Los Angeles Police Department precincts across the city. Now, what is happening here? So when you're classified as a gang member, or when a crime is classified as gang-related, the consequences are very different, not only in terms of questions of sentencing and judgment, but also in terms of police scrutiny, right? So that generally means heavier prison sentence, inclusion in civil gang injunctions, potentially additional criminal charges as well. So the pain wrought upon a misclassification of a crime or someone in relation to the quote-unquote gang term is not necessarily one that's taken into account with this system itself. So how the system functions, it gathers police data and it uses what's described as a partially generative neural network, which is an algorithmically written crime report based on 3 other features used in the training model. And the generated text isn't actually read by anyone, nor is it presumed to provide narrative context, but it's turned into a mathematical vector and incorporated into a final prediction of whether a crime is gang-related. So one of the junior authors on this work, I bet many of you have heard of this example, Hao Chan, poor Hao Chan, I'm going to single him out here, was presenting this work at a computer science conference, type of conferences all of us have gone to. And it turned out that someone from the American Civil Liberties Union was in the room and was kind of concerned about what was going on. And Hao Chan's response, and I don't really mean this to kind of single him out in this sense, is I'm just an engineer. Okay. Now, if I'm just an engineer was sort of seen in isolation with Hao Chan, that's fair enough. But I'm just an engineer is also what we heard from Mark Zuckerberg in relation to the congressional testimony. I'll give you variations on that. When I was in my dorm room and I built a system by which people would communicate with one another, I never thought this could happen. Never mind that I run one of the wealthiest companies in the history of the world, which is built upon it not being just engineering, right? Much like Uber is not just technology company. But what does this point to? This actually, independent of whether Hao Chan or Mark Zuckerberg or other folks, and I'll speak about this example in a moment, actually I'll just allude to it right now, Amazon's facial recognition systems that could be linked to police body cameras in the United States and use cloud-based computing to basically take any protest, in theory, and identify anyone based on who attends, right? So I'm just an engineer doesn't necessarily apply very well to any of these examples, right? Because these are not examples that are merely about engineering. These are examples that are profoundly impactful on our lives. And if you are already someone from an underprivileged background based on other forms of bias that are not necessarily technological in their genesis, then you are even more pushed down by these types of systems. So this is, I think, a huge issue. The divisions that we sort of claim discursively between technology industries, engineering fields of education, and everything else that we deal with. And I will speak to my own background in this. I studied applied mathematics and computer sciences at Stanford. I went to the MIT Media Lab in graduate school. And then I started realizing, unlike what I was taught in my classes, that the best ways to understand the so-called user's experience with technology could not simply be traced to those moments by which someone was actually using the system, right? So what was I optimizing my design processes for? Many of you are much smarter than I am, so you probably were thinking better than I was. But what I was looking at was how long would someone stay online, right? How many clicks might they engage with? Whether they'd come back. You know, those sorts of, like, if you will, fairly ephemeral forms of data. That's what I was looking at in terms of so-called human-computer interaction user effects, right? But the meaning of systems in societies, either on the level of an individual in terms of how it might shape their way of being, their way of knowing, but on a social and political level, on an economic level, are far more profound. And so what I'm getting at is that I'm just an engineer phrasing actually reflects a problem that we have in our educational systems, which is interesting to note. And a lot of this is getting attention now because, of course, the United States election and so on. Now we're seeing front page New York Times story, you know, computer science departments to offer data ethics courses. I think NYU was like at the front of the line in trying to do that, right? And that's really important. I'm very grateful and appreciative that that's occurring. But we really need to think about mechanisms by which our professionalized lives and our educational lives are actually built holistically in terms of their curricula, where we are thinking socio-technically, techno-culturally, all these kinds of terms that we use where we blend tech and XYZ, right? And so the question for me, and what I'm sort of self-taught in a lot of ways, being a former engineer, working in engineering companies, building machine learning systems back in the day, 20 years ago, right? What I sort of realize is how we can build those sorts of understandings, those sorts of holistic, those externalities-based understandings in design, in engineering, and in understandings of technologies themselves. And to me, that's what data sciences are. Data sciences are not necessarily set in some sort of formal division from data ethics or data cultures or data societies, right? They all infuse and harmonize with one another, ideally in this sense. So to give you an example, I've kind of recently become friends with Michal Kosinski. I don't know how many of you know his work. So he is sort of seen, he's kind of inextricably linked in most writing that one reads about Cambridge Analytica, who I had pretty strong contact with. I was attempting to interview them, you know, before they, you know, fell apart for my new book. And Michal is a professor at the Stanford Business School. He's an assistant professor. He did his PhD and maybe his postdoc here in the UK at Cambridge University. And he's done that research that I think almost all of us have heard about this argument that he could build computer models using Facebook likes and other data trails, what he describes as digital traces is what he describes it as. And he says, you know, I'll just kind of read you a little of his work. With 10 likes, he can build a system that knows you better than a colleague. With 70 likes, better than a friend or a roommate. With 150 likes, better than a family member. 300 likes, better than your spouse. And he makes the point that it's not simply about Facebook likes. And that, of course, intuitively makes sense. But it's also really about what does it mean to know someone, right? And whether who I present myself on, and Mark and I are friends on Facebook, who I present myself on, how you literally present yourself, you know, like, am I presenting myself, my world online in a way that's truly authentic to who I am, or is that only part of who I am? Because who I present myself to be in different kinds of public contexts differs based on how I choose to articulate myself in those parts of my life, right? So Kosinski does understand that point when I was sort of asking him questions about it. But he said, what happens when I can take not just your Facebook data, but aggregate that, cross-reference that, right, with your credit card data, right? In the United States, I think it's much better here. But in the United States, much of our public data, I'm sorry, not public data, but our data trails are purchasable with data brokers and so on, right? There are companies that specialize in doing such, like Axion, right? And so what happens when you take so-called different streams of data and bring them together? How is myself, when I'm home with my wife, insofar as that can be recorded, and it is, and it's not just because she has an Amazon Echo, which I've turned off all the time. It's not simply that. It's how is that performance of my identity, when it's aggregated or connected with other ways in which I perform my identity, all of which releases digital traces and trails, how is that a way of knowing someone? And what is it that's being known of someone, right? So that's simply, like getting back to the start of my talk, that's not simply a question of, it's partly a question of what data is being recorded, which we don't know, but it's also how is that data being computed and learned upon, which we also don't know, with what effects, which we barely know. So these are really important issues. And kind of another last example of that is the word embedding research that was out, which was published in Science, which it was a system, mind you, that's designed not simply as a kind of quote unquote neutral computational system, but a system that is to potentially be deployed in lieu of human resources work, right? An automated system that would do that work instead of human resources work, right? Relates to this big theme of automation. And so what this research what this algorithm would do is it would analyze and scan using text mining techniques and latent semantic indexing techniques, various CVs, and make decisions about which CVs to kind of move on to the next round and which not. And any of you who have applied for a job know that it's often that first cut that's the hardest, right? You kind of go from, I remember academic jobs, it was like 500, 600 applications. Once you get down to 10, you're like, okay, I have a real shot. So if that first cut is made by a system that this research finds is much more likely to associate European American names with pleasant words with African American names with unpleasant words, 50% chance of selecting a European American over an African American with fairly identical CVs, then we have another issue, right? Because encoded into these systems that even select people to get into industries, which they can hopefully advance their work around, encoded into those systems are the kinds of systemic biases that are prevalent in our society. So this relates to this work on word embedding. And what it was attempting to do was look at a corpus of 840 billion words and try to draw connections between those words themselves and how those words might be related. So what we see is, again, the systems that are so-called ordering our world, that are infusing themselves in our industries, in our public lives, in our institutions, are themselves framed as neutral, but they're actually refracting the very biases that we have as humans and normalizing them. And a last example many of you must have heard about was the Google image recognition system that had a lot of trouble disambiguating images of black people from images of gorillas. And of course, Google apologized for that once they realized, right? This is not intentional, but this is built into these systems that are fairly pervasive. But the way they responded to it is very telling. They removed gorillas from their image recognition search. I think that that's very meaningful. Huh? Please?
We've all done that.
Yeah, of course. Of course. And so I've had a couple opportunities to interact. I'm from Silicon Valley myself. I went to the same high school as Jobs and Wozniak, and I went to Stanford at the same time as folks who were in my dorms, and I saw drunk at parties and whatever, ended up founding companies like PayPal and so on. And what you sort of see as a kind of critical response in some of those circles within Silicon Valley is this, the super intelligence fear, right? You all know what I'm talking about, right? The so-called, what was it called? It's uncanny, not only singular, but uncanny valley. That's that term, right? So this is an expression that I've heard, this kind of concern of kind of, recursive emergent behavior. I've seen expressions of that from folks like Sam Altman, who I've interviewed several times. Sam Altman is close with Elon Musk. They created an organization together called OpenAI. And Altman is a billionaire who's, I think, under the age of 30, and started a group called Y Combinator, which is, kind of launched a lot of businesses, right? And so it's interesting for me to think about AI and automation and algorithms in sort of in all of these different facets, right? So where is it that the energy and scrutiny on ensuring that these systems are going to be democratic, are going to help us in ways that are based on social and collective and philosophical conversations that we're going to have with one another? Who's having those discussions, right? And I think we're having those. But in Silicon Valley itself, I see a paucity of some of that from the folks I've interviewed out there. Okay. Interestingly enough, our right-wing media in the United States has been somewhat concerned about some of these issues. This is Tucker Carlson. I don't know how many of you know Tucker Carlson, but he interviewed a colleague of mine, Robert Epstein. Robert Epstein is a psychologist who's been looking at the impact of search results and the ability for them to, in his mind, flip elections. Okay? So Epstein and colleagues did some research in India, in Australia, and in the United States, and looked for various questions that one might ask online about various issues, political issues, and looked if you scaffolded or masked the ordering of those issues just slightly from first and third results to second and third results, one candidate versus another. He argues, using the data, and we can talk more about his research if you're interested later, that he could that flips can occur from 50-50 to 90-10 with undecided voters, right? So if you actually look at this, building on the back of work like that showed, for example, how the get out the vote button, which said, hey, Mark, not your real name, but whatever your name is on Facebook, went and voted today, and how that might influence me to vote on Facebook, or other types of systems, you can see that you can actually change the numbers of folks that can vote for a given candidate, not simply by masking or ordering results or filtering results, but also by the very presence of vote or not, targeted toward particular individuals, right? So Facebook's so-called A/B testing was able to uncover this in an experiment they did a few years ago. So this is, kind of all leads my colleague Zeynep Tufekci to make the argument that, some of these sorts of systems that are doing recommendations and auto-suggestions end up privileging radicalization. And that's not, of course, again, because the systems are built by those who wish to radicalize us. But the question really is what are these kind of multidimensional forms of computing outputting in terms of their results, in terms of what is suggested to you? So a lot of this evidence, to be completely honest, is anecdotal, okay? And I think I need to say that. I think you agree with that, I can tell. But what it does mean, let's just speak to her work on this, is what might be suggested to you when you kind of use auto-suggestion features and so on might be designed to keep you engaged or online, right? So if the question is one of maintaining your attention, to kind of cite Tim Wu's work on the attention merchants on this work, then one thing that we do know is that as human beings, we love our vegetables and we love our red meat. We love our, our porn and our tabloids as much as, and we also love some of the kind of more virtuous aspects of our lives, virtuous forms of digestion. So the point that she was making is that what ends up becoming visible or suggested by such systems is often based on the logic of maintaining attention. That means in her particular case, she was watching, Trump rallies on YouTube and so on, and was being suggested content that became more white nationalist or neo-Nazi in its focus. So this can actually become a radicalizing factor, and I think it's important for us to realize that what we might see in our own portals online via various proprietary technologies might be completely different than what another might see, right? Not only does that impact what might be targeted toward me as kind of third-party content, as per like Cambridge Analytica and so on, but it also means that what might be suggested to me online could also be only something that I end up seeing, right? So that's part of the issue here. Our kind of portals into public life, into political life and so on, are actually ones that are individualized for us, but not necessarily ones that are transparent to others. So this is a mechanism that could atomize us in terms of aspects of civic and public and political life. Give you a couple quick examples of that. Many of you probably know of this story. In Sri Lanka, what ended up becoming more visible on folks' Facebook feeds in contexts where there's not a very strong independent media or strong sort of public and civic institutions, became misinformation. Information that basically alleged that the Muslim minority population, and I'm Tamilian myself, so a lot of this was targeting Tamil Muslims in Sri Lanka, were actually behind a number of crimes that were occurring in Sri Lanka, and that ended up generating violence against those Muslims. Another example I'll give you, in Las Vegas, when there was a mass shooting several months ago in the United States, what became trending when we looked on Google News and on Facebook was content that first started on 4chan, was picked up by the blogosphere, and became viral, and then became normalized again by those systems. Again, the question for me is, what are those systems privileging visibility around, prioritization around? So these are themes that I think are really important because they get down to the very basics of how we choose to divide private life and public life, how we choose to divide our individual lives with our social lives. And I think all of this is at the root of what I'm trying to puzzle through in this new book that I'm working on. So that actually ties into work that I've been describing about net neutrality itself. This is an interview I did with Joy Reid where I was debating a lobbyist from Verizon about net neutrality and why net neutrality is so important. And so in the United States right now, we're in this kind of murky zone. We're not exactly sure whether we're going to be able to maintain net neutrality or not. The FCC Commissioner, Ajit Pai, has attempted to roll back net neutrality, which was sort of advanced during the Obama era. And one of the responses to that that's been getting some attention in the media is, what if we think about communities themselves, user communities, taking power over their own infrastructures? And these are small-scale issues, using mesh networks and other types of technologies. But this is an important theme to think about because many communities in the world are not necessarily served by big ISP or big telecom interests, or other communities might be concerned with the arrangements that they've agreed to when they've signed on to such interests. So one example, there are examples all over the world. One of the largest is in Catalonia called GuifiNet. Some of you probably know of that or know them. But in Detroit, folks have been building their own sort of community-oriented internet and intranet, the Detroit Community Technology Project. And so this is one of the interesting examples that I write about in my new book. When Whose Global Village, my first book, came out, I wrote a piece for Quartz describing a very simple situation. I was invited to visit the country of Cameroon on a UNESCO visit. And maybe I was not smart about engaging with this process, but I just simply searched Cameroon on my Google browser. I was also curious what I'd end up seeing, right? And what I saw, of course, on my first page of results was not a single web page from Cameroon, which is a country that has a very high, fairly high internet penetration rate, a pretty strong blogosphere, and actually is Anglophone and Francophone, right? So there is a lot of content actually from Cameroon that could have been made visible to me. Now, again, it's not because Google is anti-Cameroon. It's not because of necessarily racial issues, but it's about those invisible questions of what counts as knowledge, right? And so I would be very interested in kind of understanding when I experience visibility of information on various platforms why I see what I see. And even allowing me the opportunity to specify further alternative pathways by which I could engage in visibility of information. At the very minimum, I think that's important. So I want to give you a couple quick thoughts that come from my first book, just to give you a few examples of kind of what my work came from and how it's kind of gone into this space. That's the cover, and that's the cover of the second book, which looks at more activism, media activism and tech activism issues. So a key concept that I kind of worked with in my first book is around the term ontology. That's a term that's defined in very different ways in fairly different fields, in philosophy and computer sciences. I was looking at that term from the kind of science and technology studies perspective, and I was really interested in the question of not only what counts as knowledge, but how we express that knowledge, right? Sort of on a philosophical and conceptual level. How do we build systems based on the ways we choose to articulate our views of the world, how we know what we know, right? And we obviously know that that is encoded in our languages, in our cultural practices, but even in the technological systems that we use. So one example from my earlier work is this was back when I was doing my PhD. I was living and working with a group of Native Americans who were basically trying to do something like what I was describing in Detroit. They were trying to build their own kind of, if you will, sovereign digital infrastructure, which was called the Tribal Digital Village. But I was a graduate student at that time, and I was invited by the leaders of those tribal communities to think about how we might build a system that organized information that they wanted to exchange across the 19 Native American reservations. So we built maps like this, right? which are not necessarily non-Cartesian on any level at all, but they at least try to identify themes and categories and ideas and concepts that were important and meaningful for those communities themselves. So what am I getting at here? People would share videos, they would share images, they would share information across these reservations, basically very fragmented communities, and I describe it in a lot of detail in the book, in chapter 3 of my book. But the way folks would tag that content or organize that content or classify that content was we attempted to not only democratize that, but actually build that on a community-based model, right? So the layers by which those systems organized and indexed and retrieved information was what we were working on an ethnographic and collaborative level, participatory level. In the book, I also describe work I did for several years, funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, with the Zuni community. So this is an interesting example. Here are several Zuni cultural leaders, and you're wondering like what they're looking at, and it looks like a pelt, but it's also a map, right? It's an indigenous map. And so what's interesting here is the parallels between an image like this and an image like that. In both cases, we see the kind of collective practice of engaging with a different technology. They're both technologies, right? The map's a technology, and the system that we design together is a technology. But at Zuni, and here's the point I want to get at Zuni, knowledge and engagements are usually not individualized. It often, what you do and how you engage has everything to do with who you are in the community, right? Like everything from your kinship group to your gender to your age, kind of age range and so on, initiation and so on. And so I'll give you a really interesting example of this. We had built a system that had made possible for the Zuni to access several hundred, I think about 850 images of objects that were taken from their community. We worked actually with the British Museum, had some of their objects, other museums around the world. And we just built a system that allowed them to digitally look at digital images of the objects. It's not the same as the object itself. Not even trying to claim that. And there's a lot of work on the so-called virtual repatriation that I personally think is nonsense. Because it's not repatriation. It's not the image of it's the image of the object, right? And so as folks would engage with images to kind of weave them into their school systems, their cultural systems, and even their applications to get objects back, this is how they would engage with those images. It'd often be like a dozen plus people in a room talking about one object, sometimes for 2-3 hours, changing languages. And I was observing this because after about 10 years of working there, I was invited into these meetings. And folks at various times would put their fingers in their ears. And they wouldn't put their fingers in their ears to be rude. They would put their fingers in their ears because that was knowledge that was being discussed that they were not supposed to know about at that point. They would change languages at times, and between Zuni or Ashiwi and English. So that's also very interesting. And what they would share back, because the museums were interested in whatever these folks would be interested in sharing back, what they would share back would not necessarily be what they discussed in the Zuni language, but what they chose to write down in the English language. So I just think that that's interesting because here's an engagement not only on a design level, but on kind of a question of collective use that sort of opens up cultural systems of knowing, cultural ontologies. Right? So ontology can be seen as how we develop a knowledge base like psych or whatever. It can also be really about the question of power over knowledge and kind of that collective practice of knowing. And I can give you a lot more examples of this. A lot of this is in the book. So as I alluded to, I was really, my work of the last couple of years has been down in southern Mexico. And what I've been looking at out there, similar to examples that I talked about from Detroit very briefly from Catalonia, is the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world. And that's a project called Rizomatica, and it's in the Oaxaca region of southern Mexico. And what we now have are about 5,000 plus folks across 30 communities in the mountains around Oaxaca. It becomes extremely remote and not many infrastructures up there. But they've basically, using open source technologies, have built their own community-owned, that's the key point, community-owned networks. And this is not because this is partly because the telecom companies did not want to go there because there's not enough people and there's not enough money, and because the reliance on other infrastructures is not something that can be counted on. But these folks said, well, if they are not going to come here, we can build it ourselves. So again, collectivity is not just this kind of ontological reception point that I made earlier, but can also be seen in relation to questions of decentralizing ownership and design, right? And so to me, that's really, really interesting. If we have time, I'd love to show you a video, or I'll just send it out to Mark and he can send it around, that introduces the project. And I've been out there trying to think about what emerges from this other model of thinking about technological, not just design, but ownership itself. And this is work I'm doing with Lisa Parks right now. We're looking at this in in an international, cross-disciplinary sense across the world, because we see examples like this all over the place. So, while I was fairly critical of some of these kind of tech and predictive policing projects, I also want to kind of underscore the point that this is not the destiny, the inherent destiny written into technology, nor is it the inherent present of technology either. Okay. I'm actually headed to Uganda quite soon, the Makerere University. There's an AI research group that's been founded there. We were communicating about that, I remember briefly. And that's really interesting to me, the question of what does AI look like when it's kind of built out of particular sites, right? It's kind of embedded in territory, embedded in culture, embedded potentially in collectivity, insofar as that is part of the cultural practices or systems of those places or those countries or those communities. And so this is something I'm yet to know much about, and they've framed their work in the ICT development space a little bit. So I'm kind of not sure how much space there is for learning models or data sets. I think there's quite a bit on data sets that are emerging from those places, or even the applications of those systems. But that's something I'm very interested in, given my earlier work, the question of not just how we build AI systems or learning systems or specialized AI systems in the context of Uganda, but what are the very models by which those systems learn? And how much of a space is there for what Cathy O'Neill describes as an auditing process of those systems? And that's interesting for me, right on the heels of an announcement from last week that some of you might have heard of, that Google is starting an AI lab in Ghana. And so that's an interesting question for me as well. There's a lot more questions that I have than answers on what that's going to look like. But the question for me is how much of that will inform what AI might look like in relation to Ghana, in what context, with what technologies? And those are all questions that I don't have the answers to, even though I've been reaching out to the people I know who work at Google around it. A last quick theme that I've been touching on for my new book is the theme of automation and labor, which I alluded to earlier. Some of you might have heard about these different mechanisms by which societies have been attempting to organize themselves in relation to the onset of automation. I think there's been a lot of, to be honest, kind of panic and anxiety-oriented statements around what kinds of industries are going to be displaced or replaced by automation. And I think that there needs to be a conversation, and there is some happening, but there needs to be even more of a conversation of what kinds of new forms of jobs that might emerge out of that, as well as a conversation around this universal basic income. And so Michael Tubbs is he's kind of a friend of mine. I met him several years ago at a conference, like kind of a public media conference, and he's under the age of 30, African-American mayor he's the youngest mayor of a city of size 100,000 or larger in the United States, came from a black single-family home, working class, and has somehow managed to become mayor at the age of 27 of this city. But that's somewhat interesting, but perhaps the more interesting part of this is how he has been trying to think about processes by which that recognize and embrace kind of the onset of so-called technological innovation and automation, but it's also trying to think about how can we prepare societies and with what types of effects these sorts of forms of automation may have. So he's been working with folks in the so-called Economic Security Project in the United States, and they're about to start an experiment where they're going to give selected families across different class strata, across different kinds of socioeconomic and demographic strata, a certain amount of money, some kind of so-called basic income or portable benefits packages on a monthly basis to try to see what kinds of effects that produces. And all of that really touches on, I think, a theme that I'm really interested in, and you'll hear more about it the next time I'm sure we talk, which is really the theme of externalities, right? And so I've been reading some of the work of the Nobel Prize winning economist Elinor Ostrom. She's been influential on a lot of us. And she had, and what I'm interested in here is it's very tied to the rhizomatica example, the example from Oaxaca, perhaps this example as well, is how can we kind of understand, how can we value and build models that value the effects of systems outside of their internal logics themselves, right? So give you a kind of practical example. If all you care about is the value of your own house, again, these are very US examples. If all you care about is the value of your house in the United States, generally speaking, you look for the quality of the school district, specifically the public school district, the public education in that very area, right? Or, here's another example. Public health is obviously positively correlated with economic health, right? It isn't? Yeah, well. No, I think we're going to have a conversation. It's great. So, well, if you are, anyway. There are positive linkages between some of these phenomena, not in all cases, but in many cases. And the point I want to make is that if we try to look at the non-economic effects associated with economic transactions, or the non-technological effects associated with technological transactions, then we start to open up our vocabulary and understanding of not only how we design systems and build systems, but how do we understand their meaning and engagement with us in our societies. So with that, I would like to engage with you all in questions, and I'd like to take yours first. Because you've been you couldn't wait to talk to me. Thank you. And you can engage with me by email and also on Twitter.